In this episode, I talk with Ohad Maislish, the CEO and co-founder of N0, and one of the advocates driving OpenTF. We discuss open source software and licenses more broadly, the HashiCorp license changes, and the OpenTF manifesto and fork. Enjoy. Ohad, how's it going?
Hi, this is going well today. How are you, William?
I'm pretty good. I heard, so I work with a lot of folks, around your neck of the woods, and I'm hearing there's a lot of humidity. The monsoon type smog and the rain and everything. It's more humid than normal in Northern California.
It's pretty hot over here and humid. Even with the AC, I'm sweating, so not sure what else I can do.
Yeah, that's it's you generally don't hear that from anybody that's in California. Really, usually California's got the perfect weather. So yeah, that's more in line
No,
with what I experience here in Kentucky. A lot of humidity.
yeah,
So
there are some
yeah,
rough few weeks, but I hope to get over those soon.
right on. Well, thank you for joining. We have some pretty interesting uh, topic that we're going to discuss today. It's been a very interesting month for open source, which
Sure.
is what we're going to kind of get to. And I guess just out of the gate, what is open source and how does it differ from like your proprietary software, just at a high level?
I think it's very clear. Open source is that you have source which is open, so it's both available but also free to be used in any way you want. You can just take it as is and do your things with that. You can put it in your product, in your commercial offering, and that allows you to contribute to that from different incentives. So it's very often a win-win situation. You do something that helps others, and others helps the other help the open source
Gotcha.
project itself. If it's more closed source, proprietary, you need your engineers to work on that, and you also get less feedback from others how to improve that. But the good thing about that is that nobody can take advantage of whatever you've built. So it's case by case. You need to choose when it makes sense to do A or B.
Sure. So, quick question: what role do foundations play in this whole? Because I'm seeing, with this HashiCorp license change, one thing I'm seeing all over Twitter and LinkedIn is, oh, well, the foundations. It's got to be backed by a foundation. So, what role do foundations play in open source software more broadly?
Yeah, so there are two types of open sources projects. Both are with the same license. It can be Apache or MPL or MIT, but it really depends who owns this project. If it's a vendor, if it's a company, it means that it's currently open source, and maybe later that can be changed. Uh, whereas if it's part of a foundation, it means that it stays open source forever. Kubernetes, I think, is a great example of a CNCF based project, which is open source, and no vendor, nothing can take that and change its license. So when I choose as a developer to use open source, I need to ask myself, what if? What's going to happen if at some point of time this vendor that holds this open source might make a decision? And as we all know, those things happen, and a major thing happened exactly 3 weeks ago. So yeah, open source can be permanently with a foundation, and CNCF is the leading one to manage those open sources versus a vendor-backed open source, which is temporary.
Gotcha. That makes perfect sense. And it's funny because the CEO of GitLab got involved on LinkedIn the other day, advocating essentially for an open charter
Yep.
approach as a means of holding some of these companies accountable to their commitment to an open source license. Do you know what that means? And is it a good idea? It sounds like a good idea to me.
I'm not a lawyer, but I think this is a very interesting approach because sometimes when it's in a foundation, it has both it has the guardrails of the foundation, which are both good and bad. If you have full control of your project, you might be able to move faster. So how you can have maximum uh, flexibility, but still ensuring your customers and your community that the license will stay free forever. So the open charter approach is definitely interesting and innovating. Again, I'm not a lawyer, but I read some comments on what the CEO of GitLab wrote, and somebody mentioned a concept that exists in Switzerland of companies or some kind of like somewhere between a foundation and an LLC and C corp, like a combination of several things that includes the concept of open charter within the structure of this entity. So again, I'm not a lawyer, but maybe we're going to see more companies incorporated in Switzerland or something in order to ensure those concepts for open source that combine both the flexibility and the guardrails of not changing the license. But again, I'm not a lawyer, but it's definitely an interesting direction and approach to look at.
Yeah, yeah. It sounds like there's a few different options that could be explored there. So, the big topic of this conversation, we're going to get to OpenTF, but kind of want to discuss what led to OpenTF. So, HashiCorp, August 10th, I think August 10th,
Yep.
switched over the licensing for their what appears to be their whole product suite.
Yep.
Including Terraform, which was 9 years going at this point. So,
Yep.
um, as a company, HashiCorp again, they did this I think with all the different products in their complete portfolio. And can you explain just the licensing changes they took? So they went from MPL to BSL. What does that mean, and why is it actually impactful to the community and to other organizations that have built products on top of Terraform?
Yeah, sure. As far as I remember, they've changed almost all of their projects, but not every single project, but definitely the vast majority of their project. And they chose a not that common approach, which is called BSL. Before talking about BSL, I want to talk about SSPL. For example, MongoDB and Elastic took the approach of SSPL, which is also not open source, but it's a different kind of source available license. SSPL, think about Elastic or MongoDB or Vault in HashiCorp's case. And let's say I want to sell as a vendor that has this open source, I want to sell Vault per hour. Let's say $1 per hour of using Vault as a service. I provision the EC2 instance, I deploy Vault there, and then I offer this EC2 instance that runs Vault for $1 an hour. And then comes another vendor and say, I'll just do the same, but I'll offer that for 90 cents an hour. So, very thin layer on top and just selling that as a service. So SSPL is designated to prevent those cases, and it's usually more relevant for products or services that are up and running and offer something as a service. So yeah, that's definitely a very common case that we saw in the last few years. And I mentioned MongoDB and Elastic as two very common examples of SSPL. BSL, however, is very flexible. Basically, it means you can write some text of what you allow or what you don't allow for users to do with this open source. So BSL is a very, very flexible, maybe vague is the right terminology. So HashiCorp chose to use BSL for all of their products, which is interesting. Again, I wasn't part of their discussions, but I'm not sure why they did it this way. Maybe changing most of the things to SSPL and maybe just Terraform to do BSL, because SSPL is not relevant for something like Terraform. Terraform is is closer to, let's say, a language. It's not a language. HCL is the underlying language, but it's definitely not a service. It's something else. And they've defined something very short in text, but very vague in its effect, which is you cannot host or embed Terraform for commercial use that competes with basically a commercial offer of HashiCorp in production. And then there were like tons of questions. Well, what does it mean? I can compare to another license, which is BSL, and one of the projects of MariaDB, who created BSL. They wrote something very simple. If you use this for more than 3 instances, that's a violation. Okay, so you know, if you have 1, that's okay. If you have 2, that's okay. But if you have more than 3, that's a violation. Host or embed, commercial offer, competing. Is it now? Is it in the future? What happens if? Tons of questions that started popping from this license change. And when there is uncertainty, things happen. And that's one of the reasons why OpenTF started.
Gotcha. Do you think just, I know it's, of course, nobody knows exactly all the circumstances behind a thing, but HashiCorp decided to run an IPO, in December of 2021. In your opinion, is this change in licensing a result of that post-IPO market, which was not the greatest market, and finding every possible way to increase revenue, like not leaving any stone unturned, having to show that growth?
First of all, I have to say that I'm a big HashiCorp fan. I've used Vagrant a decade ago. I worked at VMware, so seeing something like Vagrant was really interesting for me, and I personally used that a long time ago when I think HashiCorp were like 10 employees or something like that. Long story short, eventually they grew nicely, very nicely. They were about $500 or $600 million in revenues per year, went IPO, and for probably a bunch of reasons, it looks like their stock is not doing that well. Again, I'm not a lawyer, but I'm also not a Wall Street analyst to analyze all of the circumstances of that situation. Looks like they have very strong leadership, very experienced leadership, and they're doing what they think makes sense to do. As they've written, some other companies before them changed their license. It's a big decision, but it's definitely something that they're able to do, and we'll wait and see what's the impact of this decision for them. But it's definitely a big decision. It's something they decided to do.
Yeah, business decision at the end of the day. And like you said, the BSL, this license is fairly vague, which can be, sometimes vague is good, sometimes vague is very problematic, and you think of like vague by design, it might be to make like legal's job easier as they enforce things, like in the event that HashiCorp wants to be that sole arbiter of all things Terraform, they have a lot of leeway, a lot of room to take things on a case-by-case basis, it would seem. And that's kind of like looking back at like all the other cases of this happening for these post-IPO companies that have gone through this transition. It seems like, that sort of scenario. So say nothing happens. Say nothing. OpenTF never would have been a thing, and everybody just went along quietly with this decision. Sunshine and rainbows. Does taking the commercial approach like this here like alienate the community that helped build Terraform, this open source community in which it was, riding on, up until IPO?
Definitely
And does it make it
HashiCorp.
less relevant also?
Mhm. So definitely HashiCorp enjoyed from the support of the community so far a lot of contribution and brand awareness, brand credibility dramatically increased thanks to working closely with the community. But obviously there is a lot of expense that comes with doing this move. So you have something to gain, but something to lose when you work with the community, it costs money, and somebody needs to pay for that. So yeah, that's what they did, and eventually they decided to change their license, as you mentioned, to some vague terms. I personally got a call from a founder of a startup that told me that his investors are asking him what's going to happen, and they currently don't compete with any HashiCorp product, so they're probably okay now. But what does it mean for the future of his company and for the future investments coming from future investors? Trying to understand what happens if in the future HashiCorp builds a competing product, or if in the future this founder builds some other capabilities that will then compete with existing or future things of HashiCorp. HashiCorp on August 21st updated their frequently asked questions page in a very unique way. Not sure if you know that, William, but they released a blog and wrote in that blog that this is a binding blog, and added several more answers, including that whatever you have today and whatever HashiCorp builds in the future, that's not competition, which is very, very interesting to understand the logic of what this license is trying to prevent. But
Yeah.
what
What was
happened?
the point of it all then?
Yeah, it's gonna limit HashiCorp, because if HashiCorp's gonna build products that they believe in, then the community can use those open sources BSL license to compete with them. Or maybe then they will change again the another blog, binding blog. What happens? It's not mentioned there, by the way. What happens if you, as a vendor in the future, build solution? It only talks about what you, as a vendor, have now and what they will build in the future. And again, the fact that this was released 11 days after their announcement, and it wasn't released originally, in my honest opinion, it adds more risk and more uncertainty for a lot of founders, investors, and community projects. Do they want to invest more time with the Terraform ecosystem? Or maybe there is a good alternative, such as Pulumi or Crossplane, that are open source. Or so maybe we need to invest more time there and less time in an unstable license and rules that that change more than once already. By the way, they did a third change in their licensing. So the first change was the actual BSL license. The second change was the binding BSL binding blog with more answers, which is, I think, in any case, very. I'm not sure the status of that, because the actual license doesn't link to those blogs. And the third thing they've done on August 24th, they didn't announce that, by the way, which is interesting to think of. They've changed the terms and conditions of the Terraform registry. So I don't know what's next. But in any case, they didn't change all of those things in the same day. They did it gradually. So maybe next week there are going to be more changes. So if I'm a founder, if I am an investor, if I am somebody working in the community for some adjacent project, all of those things mean that there is a lot of risk going on. So I think it was a great day for Pulumi. It was a great day for Crossplane, and they are now the leading open source infrastructure as code frameworks, because Terraform is no longer open source. And that's why we thought that OpenTF makes a lot of sense, because it has a vast ecosystem, but a lot of vendors and community need that open source and open source forever without rules changing.
Yeah. Yeah. In the spirit of open source and in the spirit of keeping Terraform open source, Yeah, not long after the original license changes were announced, I saw the first blog about the OpenTF manifesto
Definitely.
and the rallying of the community behind this, and then really not that long after the actual fork. Do you want to talk about the sort of plan, like what led up to the manifesto and then going into the fork and the sort of the timing? Because I saw the manifesto and I was like, okay, they'll maybe sit on this for a few months and then maybe fork because they're probably not going to hear anything from HashiCorp. And then it was like, okay, I signed in the other day and I was like, wow, it happened. Let's roll.
Yeah, we move fast. So, because this is important, and soon HashiCorp is going to release 1.6 version, which includes the test feature and some other small enhancements. So if we would have waited for a few months, it makes it totally irrelevant. But back to your question, uh, N of Zero and other companies and other influencers in the community that we know each other very well from the past few years. Obviously, after such a big announcement, we immediately started talking with each other. And we all assumed that a lot of companies now are in a challenging situation. If you stick with Terraform and you continue using Terraform 1.6, 1.7, there are two risks for you to do that. A, you have vendor blocking decision for the managed solution, which is Terraform Cloud, Terraform Enterprise, which is both good and bad. The good thing is that there is a vendor that fully supports that and will invest a lot of money to make that product better. But you as a customer, you don't have options to migrate, and probably the prices will increase when there is one vendor in the market. But maybe even more interesting, what I mentioned earlier, if there is no open source, gradually the community will invest more time in other open source projects such as Pulumi and Crossplay. So thinking of your strategic decisions 2 years later, 5 years later, where you want to focus your technology, there is a reason why Terraform was better than CloudFormation, because it is open source and so many things worked with that. And now there are so many providers, so many modules, so many adjacent tools like TFSec, TerraScan, InfraCost. All of those work nicely with Terraform. And Pulumi and Crossplane are great tools, but they don't have the same ecosystem as Terraform. So from every angle we've looked at that, we strongly believe that there is a big need for the same concept of Terraform. We don't want people to migrate their code. We just want their code to work as is, but use an open source CLI. It's 9 years old. It's pretty stable. If you look at GitHub, not too many engineers in HashiCorp actually work on that. It's pretty reasonable for other vendors and community to manage the CLI at this stage of this project. So we've realized it's something very reasonable and relevant to do. And also there's an opportunity here to build a leading open source framework and donate that to the CNCF, which builds more trust for the community to invest even more in that ecosystem. So yeah, we just immediately started talking with each other, and we started working on the manifest and the fork very quickly. And soon it's going to be released. We need to do some final fixes and adjustments, and then it's going to be released as a public repo, and I think it's going to be super exciting for the entire community, and I think the future is very bright for OpenTF.
Yeah. And you talked a little bit about CNCF, but this is, I know you move fast. That's great. But you're also, it looks like, trying to move fast in the right direction by making some of the right strategic moves. I think I read, it might have been an N0 blog about already filing paperwork to be, adopted for the Linux Foundation. So that's already in the works.
Yeah, definitely. It's in final stages. In order to be in the CNCF, you first need to be in the Linux Foundation, and then you become a project, a sandbox project, then an incubating project, and eventually a graduated project in CNCF. So that's the standard process, and definitely it's in the final stages.
Awesome. So I got to throw a few curveballs. This conversation's been a little too easy,
Go
of
ahead.
course. So, as you alluded to earlier, the different licensing changes, and mainly the one where HashiCorp updated their terms of service for registry. And according to those terms, you can only use providers and modules and whatever else like policies that exist in there from registry solely for use with HashiCorp's official Terraform. Um, I looking, at the timeline of everything, I almost see that as like a direct response to OpenTF, but we don't have to go there. It doesn't matter at this point. But do you think this sort of makes Terraform like a walled garden, almost like an Apple store in a sense, doesn't it?
Maybe. But I think eventually I fully agree with what Kelsey Hightower wrote in Twitter about a week ago that the future of Terraform will be in a way similar to the future of HTTP, that there is like one concept but different browsers, different implementations. So I think same goes with the registry. Yeah, there are providers and modules. The vast majority of those exist out there in GitHub. Uh, and you've mentioned policies. I think those policies currently are just Sentinel policies, which is the HashiCorp proprietary policies. So
Right.
obviously those are irrelevant for the OpenTF ecosystem. Uh, but yeah, we will share some updates about how we gonna work with this new change in their terms and conditions for the registry, and it's yet another thing that will be addressed.
So just out of the gate, and this is a question I've fielded from a lot of folks as well, privately. But say that I'm a vendor and I maintain a Terraform provider, maybe along with some specialized modules for that provider. And I have contributors both inside my company and out in the community that are contributing to these modules and things. With OpenTF, and as things, eventually things are going to diverge. Hey, you could have end-to-end encrypted state files, and the Terraform core may not have that. So, would we now have to manage two separate providers and have separate modules, with a separate registry? I mean, will it eventually come to that? Is it a phased approach? Is it too early to tell? I know it's a hard question, but yeah, just kind of curious on your take there.
So if I may guess, in the upcoming future, uh, nothing is really going to change for the providers and modules. As I mentioned, HTTP protocol. So same goes here. Regarding the registry, it's a different thing. The registry is a service. So yeah, things might be different there. But eventually, you as a vendor, and you write a provider, you develop a provider. Eventually, this provider has code. This code sits in GitHub, and this GitHub code has a license, which is probably also MPL. So anybody can take this code and create a binary or a provider or a module from this code. So you just need to do the standard thing in GitHub, maintain one version. If OpenTF has some cool features such as the encryption that you mentioned, which is, by the way, super important, but that's a different topic. It doesn't mean that it breaks compatibility of anything. It's just yet another thing that you can enjoy in OpenTF, and maybe still doesn't exist in Terraform, but it doesn't affect the providers, and that's the important thing. When you write a
Right.
provider, you don't care if there is ability to write a test, not the ability to encrypt the state, and maybe other future features that will be developed in either Terraform or OpenTF. It's very important to keep the standard, but now who defines the standard? I think it's going to be like a natural thing that evolves from both HashiCorp's roadmap and the community CNCF based OpenTF roadmap.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, the outpouring of support from the community's been gigantic. I think I checked last night, and the OpenTF manifesto on GitHub has like over 30,000 stars in like what, 2 weeks, something crazy, and like 526 contributors, adding their names and doing things, all in just 2 weeks. That's pretty. That's a vote of confidence from the community right there. That's pretty big. So where can people look if they want to find out more or get involved? And I can add things to the show notes as well.
Thank you. Yeah, as you mentioned, more than 30,000 GitHub stars for the manifest, and I think more than like 600 or 700 pledges, explicit pledges to the manifest. I can mention great companies, so not just NF0 committed for 5 engineers full time. So does Spacelift, Scalar, and just yesterday announced Harness, pledging 5 developers as well, and we're honored to have Harness. Also, super important to mention Grantwork, the creators of TerraGrant, that totally help us navigate the entire situation. They have tons of experience, both Jim and Josh. They're amazing to work with. So yeah, I encourage you all to go to opentf.org and read the manifest, read the announcement, give us a star if you want to support or pledge. We also get some heartwarming emails from individuals. Very interesting to read that. It's really promising to see all of the support that we're getting. And yeah, so that's what I encourage you to do if you support that. And I also want to mention that some people don't support OpenTF. They have different opinions. I think that's totally fine. I think you've mentioned Apple earlier. Apple is a closed system that creates great products. So I don't think there is like a good and bad approach. I think it's good for the customers to have several options, and open source has its power, has its advantages. By the way, Terraform Core itself wasn't really open source for 2 years now, meaning you couldn't contribute pull requests to the Terraform Core project for 2 years. And I think that's really important because there are a lot of requests from Terraform, and maybe now with OpenTF that should potentially and probably be more relevant for users to contribute. So yeah, if you want to contribute, you can. Very soon, the OpenTF repo itself is going to be public, not just a manifest. I know it's cool, but it's just a manifest for now officially. The repo is still private. The OpenTF repo itself is still private, but once it's public, then the focus should not be on the manifest. The focus should be on the actual repo and improve the technology together with the community.
Yeah, I love that. This doesn't have to be a, hey, we're in a snowball fight. We're just going to keep throwing snowballs and, fight till the end. Rising tide raises all ships. And I think this is, looking at it with a glass half full perspective, it could breed a lot more innovation. You might see some amazing things come out on either side that wouldn't have otherwise been there, had this not happened. So great stuff. Really appreciate you coming on to talk about this. Where can people find you on the internet if they want to give you a follow?
Awesome. So my Twitter handle is DevOps Ohad. So you can follow me on Twitter. You can go to my LinkedIn page. Also, maybe interesting to mention, I have my own podcast called the IEC Podcast, which talks about infrastructure. Infrastructure is code. That's what I do all day. And there are already like 9 or 10 episodes there. So I think you will enjoy, listening to the creators or the maintainers of Atlantis or Infracost or Styra, an open policy agent, and how all of those things affect infrastructure as code. So I also encourage people to listen to the IC podcast as well.
Awesome. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, William.